Yes, we're still not at the Sans trilogy yet, but don't worry, this is the last game before we get there. And I guess somebody had to make the series' first jump to 3D, that being Prince of Persia 3D, or Arabian Nights if you're playing on the Dreamcast, 3D being released in 1999, and Arabian Nights coming out in 2000, neither of which making a smooth transition to the third dimension. The original two Prince of Persia titles had some degree of success to them, particularly the first one. I wouldn't say they sold like gangbusters, but they didn't do terribly either. By the late 90s though, 3D gaming was the hot new thing, with so many IPs wanting a piece of the pie, and that included Prince of Persia, potentially taking that more realistic style of platforming, but adding a Z-axis to it. This maybe could have worked too, because what was one of the most popular 3D platformers at the time? Tomb Raider. Those games do have a similar feel to Prince of Persia, having to be careful with every jump and making sure you don't have an overwhelming amount of momentum to your movement. Unfortunately, the developers may have had too much inspiration from Tomb Raider, as both Pot 3D and Arabian Nights are frequently described as Tomb Raider clones with not much originality to them. Sort of forgetting that at this point in time, people were starting to get a bit sick of Tomb Raider. Hell, by 1999 we already had 4 games in the series under our belt, and when Arabian Nights first released, we just got a 5th one that not even Core Design wanted to make. Pop series creator Jordan Mechner was brought in as a creative consultant for this new 3D entry and ended up disliking the whole project as it continued, with he himself calling it a Tomb Raider clone. Mechner also wasn't happy regarding the prince's character, saying he barely recognizes him now. I'd argue it's probably not that bad, since the prince doesn't say a great deal in either version, and his dialogue is inoffensive, albeit not exactly memorable. To be a little fair to the developers, they did try and incorporate the same kind of techniques the previous games used for animations. For combat sequences, they filmed an ex-marine and a fighting consultant who expertises in weapon props for movies as the two duked each other out, and for jumping and climbing, they captured an Olympic gymnast on camera as well, then recreated all the movements into the game. It may not look as realistic as the rotoscoping used for the last two Prince of Persia titles, but it's a valiant effort to do something similar. Mindscape are more publishers than developers from what I've seen, with a lot of games I don't even recognize and very few that they actually made. The only one that I do know is Lego Island, which I've never played, but I'm aware that a number of kids at the time did, and YouTubers forever despise the name Pepperoni! Avalanche Software I'm slightly more familiar with. They did the N64 version of Mortal Kombat Mythology starring Sub-Zero, and they made a totally controversial game that's not even anything to do with the game. They've also done Disney Infinity, which, I don't know, do kids even still play that anymore? And then there's the 2 TAC games on consoles. Now I remember seeing these in commercials, but my family never bothered picking them up back when they released, and I don't recall any of my friends talking about them either. I imagine these days the TAC games are probably seen as cult classics of some kind, so maybe one day I'll give these a go. Prince of Persia 3D, as you might expect, is quite tricky to play these days on PCs due to how old it is. I did find a pirated copy already upscaled to 1080p for me, which did help, but the FMV cutscenes wouldn't run at all, and I only managed to get 2 hours in anyway before I couldn't further progress in the game, due to a consistent crash in this library section. What you're supposed to do is activate the right bookshelf to carry on, but lo and behold, the one you're supposed to flick is the one that keeps cutting my game off. The only bookshelf I could interact with was a trap that decapitates me. See kids, reading can kill ya. So that meant I had a dead game on my hands. Again. Thankfully, getting Arabian Nights to work on an emulator was super easy, and I was able to experience the game that way. Until I remembered my father already has a Dreamcast I could have used, but oh well, next time. Arabian Nights is relatively close to Pop 3D, though there are a few differences between them. On top of having more soundbites and exclusive weapons for the prince to play around with, the PC version has a floating ruins level that's missing in Arabian Nights, and slightly different stage design altogether, including item placement, more enemies, and additional sections like fighting on a boat early in the game. In the Dreamcast version, you just immediately sail to the other side of the waterbed, and only have sword upgrades to collect in terms of new weapons, aside from an ice axe that slows down enemies a little, but doesn't do as much damage, so it's not really any better than just using a regular sword. The PC version also greatly benefits by letting you save wherever and whenever you want to, but in Arabian Nights you can only save at certain parts of the level, and those save points go away as soon as you use them, again exactly like Tomb Raider 1 and 3 on PS1 with its save crystals. For the most part, I actually managed to get through this game without abusing too many save states, unlike the 2D titles. I definitely definitely felt I at least had to use a couple, like in the middle of climbing the dirigible, because they really spread out the save points halfway in. And I used another one in the Moon Temple with this wonky as hell bit of platforming where I had to redo the previous sections far too many times because the game just wouldn't let me land on these damn things without clipping onto them. The story's not any different between the two versions anyway. The Sultan, alongside the prince and princess, visit the kingdom of his brother Hassan, but one of Hassan's belly dancers ends up killing the Sultan's guards, a sentence I never thought I'd say on this channel, and throw the prince in a dungeon, just like the first game. Man, no wonder they had to rip off Tomb Raider. We're already treading familiar territory here. It turns out Hassan was promised by the Sultan in the past that his daughter's hand would be taken by his son Ragnar, a half-man, half-tiger. I won't even begin to question how that works. Holy shit, is this game promoting bestiality? For shame. We need to check the writer's browser history here. Well, unfortunately for Ragnar, the princess has already made her vows to the prince, meaning the Sultan went back on his word, and now Ragnar and Hassan want revenge. The Sultan's kind of a jackass in this game. I mean, the arranged marriage sucks already, but that's just part of the time period, I'd imagine. What's worse is that he not only failed to fulfill his promise, but he almost very easily gives up his own daughter to Ragnar and offers another wife for the prince despite the two of them being happily married, with even the prince saying that there's nobody else he'd rather be with. And this is all pointless anyway, since while Hassan tries to kill the prince by throwing a knife at him, the Sultan gets in the way and dies on the spot, now asking the prince to save the princess since his pact with Hassan means diddly squat at this current time. How about getting her back because she's your freaking daughter? Damn, what a jerk. Hassan takes this opportunity though to frame the prince for murdering the Sultan and sends his guards to pursue him, and that's about it in terms of plot. There are more cutscenes to follow, but not only does Hassan just straight up disappear from the rest of the game, nor does the witch from the last one appear at all. It's mostly just Ragnar trying to persuade the princess to be his bride, and she tells him, "Piss off, I ain't no furry." She does cut his hand off at one point, that's pretty badass. And then there's the couple of battles between the prince and Ragnar, one about 2/3 in, and another during the final level with a hidden time limit that I didn't notice initially, where the princess is tied onto a giant gear and you have to defeat Ragnar before she gets crushed. Which I accidentally failed to do when the prince was so struck with grief that Ragnar took this chance to kill the prince. Cool to see this little bit of detail put in. I just wish the rest of the game had that. Once you do win anyway, the prince pushes Ragnar into the gears, stopping the machine and killing him off, with the reunited couple literally riding off into the sunset and taking a little detour before heading home. Yeah, this plot's about as basic as the last two games, only with hideous FMVs even when they came out, and more voice acting than before that's not quite as bad as the Sega CD version of the first game, but still not anything great in my opinion. Just maybe sounds a little flat this time. It isn't only the cutscenes that look terrible though, the entire game is so muted and lifeless, even during the parts that take place outside in sunny weather. Say what you will about the problems with Tomb Raider The Last Revelation and Chronicles, but at the very least you can call them relatively good looking games for that era. Well, maybe not so much Chronicles, but definitely Last Revelation. Pop 3D is just bland and dull for both PC and Dreamcast, especially in 1999 and 2000, and with the PlayStation 2 being nearly out at that point. As I've already said maybe 3 or 4 times now as well, the gameplay also does borrow a lot from Tomb Raider, right down to the stiff controls and having similar feeling level design. Sure, the environments are a bit different to Tomb Raider, but the way you go about them isn't. Although thankfully you're not under a strict time limit anymore to save the princess. You can take as long as you want to finish the game now. Man, I can't even think about how much more difficult this would have been otherwise. The prince has the same sort of tank controls that Lara Croft does, only a little worse if you can picture that. I've made fun of the way Lara handles on occasions during past reviews, but to give those controls some credit, the stages at least do feel like they've been designed around them for the most part. Not only that, but once you do figure out the rules of how each game works in regards to different kinds of jumps and the obstacles you have to deal with, you can sort of judge ahead of time as to how to approach them. Those games allow you time to slowly learn their mechanics. Prince of Persia 3D, on the other hand, both in regards to controls and level design, simply feel tacked on. Like they thought, hey, this is what Tomb Raider did, so we should do this as well, without asking why. Moving the prince around I guess feels okay, and I like that he actually walks backwards when pressing down instead of hopping back like Lara does, but the jumps don't feel quite right to me. Going straight up somehow manages to be a little slower than it is in Tomb Raider, and jumping forward has absolutely no momentum at all. You can even do it at a standstill like you're on a catapult. It's so weird, and it's worse when you acquire the rare power-up that allows you to launch yourself at 1,000 feet. And once you jump, you're dedicated to that direction, there's no adjusting it. The Belmonts must have been here recently. Crouching returns from Prince of Persia 2, though it gets used so sparingly that I almost forgot it was even there. And my lord, this has to be some of the slowest climbing and descending I've ever seen. But swinging on ropes is a bigger pain in the ass. It feels incredibly awkward because, like jumping forward, the prince instantly leaps off when you want to reach the next platform. There's no wind up to it just happens. And jumping from rope to rope will be the bane of your existence. Come on, even Tomb Raider didn't get this right. Stop trying to make rope mechanics a thing in these old 3D platformers. Let's add swimming to the mix as well, because we clearly haven't copied enough. And oh geez, you want to talk combat? They somehow made this more irritating than it was in the 2D games. It works the same as before, where parrying and striking at the right time is the key to victory, and in this game you're able to swing your sword in 3 directions for different possibilities. But I'll tell you now, there is no point in trying to be strategic here. Just stick with swinging to the right, because for some reason that's immensely quicker than the other 2 directions. Parry the enemy's blow, attack from the right, job done. Lather, rinse, repeat. There are other moves the prince can use, like a spin attack or a lunge, but don't friggin' bother because it almost always leaves you vulnerable for an attack. The enemy's speed is somewhat inconsistent too, particularly if they block you. Sometimes they'll strike like a second afterwards and you have to beat them to the punch before you lose health. So as long as you anticipate that happening, it's not impossible to beat these guys, just pretty annoying. Especially with a couple of boss fights thrown in that have a ton of health. Oh, but you'll be lucky to even maintain all of your life. Ugh, I need to vent about that real quick too. So like the other games, you can find potions that restore a bit of your health, and also the new blue potions that refill all of it, though these are very uncommon. Now, one positive I do have about these potions is that they're stored in your inventory until you want to use them. That's rather useful compared to the 2D entries where you could accidentally end up wasting a potion if you were already at full health. In the Arabian Nights version anyway, on PC they basically act the same as they did before. The problem is that this is all you have for health recovery. And by that I mean that even clearing the level and moving on to the next one doesn't get you back to full health again. Whatever you had before starting a new stage will be what you're stuck with as you travel through areas you have no knowledge of. Oh look, water! Oh, thank God, I can use it to heal, right? No? Not yet? Well, damn it. It's also really frustrating that healing in the middle of combat is entirely worthless. Instead of instantly healing like any other game, the prince has to take a few seconds to sip a vial and get some life back, basically allowing enemies to get a free shot or two. So by the time you do heal up, that health is probably gone again, so it was all for nothing and now you're down 1 health item. At this point you think that maybe the sword upgrades might be able to help a little and do some extra damage, right? Well, yeah, it kills enemies somewhat faster, but not a substantial amount, and you're still using the same strategies as before, unless you decide to snipe enemies from afar with the prince's new bow and arrow. I do not recommend doing this that often because while aiming, the prince will plant his feet to the ground, making it difficult to avoid projectiles that enemies throw at you. Your best bet then is to hope that you find different kinds of arrows, including the standard ones, arrows that take away enemies' health and give it to you, which is my personal favorite, arrows that one-shot opponents, though these are extremely sparse, and finally exploding arrows that do a lot of damage. The basic arrows are plentiful enough to find, but I hadn't come across nearly as many of the other types of arrows, so I just didn't use them all that much unless I felt it was necessary. And the same goes for this one sword you can pick up somewhat far into the adventure that also kills enemies instantly at the cost of only being able to use it 3 times. I saved it for the final Ragnar battle, but alas, it didn't work on him. When you're not putting up with the sluggish combat and facing against hench rats as enemies, however, you've then got to try and tolerate the stages themselves. The platforming is already rather grating in a number of instances, but like the 2D games, there's also a lot of instant death traps that you need to watch out for. Unless it's spikes that just flat out blend into the floor most of the time. Like, look, how was I supposed to see that? And this is on an emulator with upscaling. That must have been practically invisible on a CRT TV. The linearity of the levels are sort of like the previous titles. Some are fairly straightforward, while others require more exploration, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, I actually don't think a few of these stages are that terrible. The prison was an okay starter level, traversing the tower afterwards wasn't too bad, and I may have even liked the climb up the dirigible. When the levels are a bit more contained, it almost works to the game's favor with the way it controls. It's when it tries being more expansive and non-linear that it doesn't, which is pretty often. The platforming just isn't built for these sorts of environments. My least favorites included the palace, rooftop, city and docks, and the moon temple. These were just plain confusing to navigate. The moon temple in particular takes for goddamn ever, and I had no clue what you're even supposed to be doing with this moonbeam puzzle. I had to follow a walkthrough to solve it. I get this is the penultimate challenge before the end, but I took one look and immediately thought, oh fuck this, I just can't be bothered right now. As for the final boss against Ragnar, unlike Prince of Persia 2 where Jafar was more of a puzzle than a battle of strength, this one goes back to the first game's route of making it a big sword duel. Ragnar is really quick, but the fight itself isn't all that bad, especially when you're able to deal some potshots on him with your bow and arrow. If you have time, that is, because again you're on an invisible clock here if you don't want to fail the princess like I did. Oops. I can certainly see some semblance of an idea with Pop 3D and how it's trying to take the older games but increase the scope with a jump to a new dimension. Sadly though, not every franchise that attempted to go 3D did it particularly well. It's very difficult being the next Mario 64 or Zelda Ocarina of Time, and I wouldn't even say this game is awful per se, just painfully average. In some ways, I find Prince of Persia 2 to be a slightly lesser title, because that one genuinely irritated me with the crap it expects you to put up with. Pop 3D, on the other hand, no matter the version, is more or less a run-of-the-mill old-school 3D platformer. It's not anything special or all that good, but there are far worse games out there. It's an interesting little experiment, but it didn't really work in this case and ends up being very unremarkable, as opposed to Shadow and the Flame that had some originality to it and wasn't afraid to be a bit bonkers. Does Pop 3D and Arabian Nights deserve a lot of the hate it gets? Definitely. Is it the weakest Prince of Persia game? Possibly. I don't think I can quite say as of yet, but certainly out of all the ones I've played, this is pretty damn low for me, and I see no problem whatsoever in skipping this unless you're an absolute die-hard fan of the series. Well, look at that. One of the most scorned entries in the series didn't turn out to be so good. I'm glad we got that cleared up. Although I'm never sure what's worse between a game that's got tons of problems and ruins the experience, or one that's simply mediocre and not very interesting to talk about. Still, it had to be done if it meant doing this marathon in order, and next up I guarantee is a much better title, and one I'm sure a lot of you are way more familiar with. We're finally going to be checking out The Sands of Time, but the next Trash or Treasure I'm doing is going to be on a rather forgotten Capcom franchise that, until somewhat recently, I hadn't played for myself. That being Dino Crisis. We're only going to be looking at the first 2 games for now, but hopefully I'll see you then. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching, stay safe, stay healthy, and take care of yourselves. Hey all, thanks again for watching this video, and if you want to see future episodes 2 days before anybody else does, which I don't know why you wouldn't want to, then consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page. On top of that, you also have your name up in the top left corner there as thanks, and you also get the first draft of my scripts after they've been written. Hope you become a patron soon, and I'll see you later.